So unfortunately, we're having some issues, or the translator we have is outside the US, and we're having some challenges with her being able to access, which has not happened before. It's a person we use all the time. So unfortunately, this is kind of a new issue for us. I don't want to keep you all waiting. I do want to get into the content. So if you do need Spanish access, please let us know in the chat, and we will make sure that the recording is translated and we get it out to everyone, so that there is access, and we can also answer your questions via Spanish language as well. So when we do get that out, you'll be able to respond to those. And my apologies for anyone affected. Again, at the same time, I don't want to just kind of wait, ad infinitum. So without further ado, I'd like us to talk about retention and recruitment. And these are, as you all know, very, significant topics right now in childcare in general and in Georgia specifically. These are also topics that are near and dear to my heart, because I will talk more about it. I love recruitment. I love retention. I think it's critical to organizations, but I also think they're really interesting subjects for us to talk about. And, what we're seeing, and I know you're seeing even more, is the challenge of, having or rather not having the quality employees that you need and that you want, and having turnover as well. And so being able to connect with the right talent is one challenge that you have. And that's something we're going to talk about today, is how do you do that effectively? The other thing that we're going to talk about today is once you do attract them, how do you retain them? And so, part of the approach that we're going to be taking on these two topics is one of, almost a sales approach, right? So how do you sell the position? How do you sell retention? And I know that may seem a little weird, but we found over the years and in other states we've worked in that this is a really effective way for childcare providers to be able to recruit and retain that talent you need. So first question that always comes up is, when's the best time to hire? And it's hard to say. I mean, I wish I had a simple, like, silver bullet answer where I could say, always hire when you hit X, then do Y, right? First and foremost, consider your future needs, right? What do you have coming up that you know about? Do you have a classroom that you may need to fill? And you know that you're getting a waiting list, and you're going to need a teacher to fill that room. What's your staffing plan? Do you have any sort of changes that you may be affecting to your staffing that could impact the number of people you're going to need? I mean, for example, one thing that we are seeing more and more is, being able to make sure that there's, ample paid time off as a retention piece. Well, that's going to drive how many people you then need on site, right? And so that could help you hire. And of course, meeting minimum standards, exceeding minimum standards. I don't want to say that it's just meeting the minimum standards and that's all you have to worry about. But I know many of you want to exceed those standards. You want to have a program that has lower ratios. And so as you start to think about those things, that becomes a great, of course, driver of your hiring. And, anytime that you're thinking about those lower ratios, you're thinking about increased quality, staff is involved. If you expect growth in your area, in your business, or you may need help, whether it's temporary because, let's say, a maternity leave or otherwise, being able to know when those things are coming up. So in other words, trying to think on a regular basis about what you have coming up and not necessarily just reacting to it. And I know I don't say that lightly. I know many of you have lots and lots of things that are going on in your childcare business. And so it's hard to sometimes then also say, okay, Gary, you're adding one more thing to me. And I am. But it's an important thing to be cognizant of and aware of. So start thinking about your pre-work before you hire. And again, as I mentioned, this is somewhat of a sales approach, right? Ultimately, what you're asking people to do is to, I often say step into the abyss, right? They're stepping into a big hole, right? They don't know you, they don't know your operation necessarily. And so the more that you can put out there who you are, why it's worthwhile for them to go to your business, the better off you are. And so having some sort of value statement for your business or program becomes really important. And being able to know for yourself as you go through this process, what's unique. And, I found over the years, and I've worked with literally thousands of childcare providers across the country, centers and family care. And what I found is that um, every center, every family care provider has some unique opportunities and unique facets to their business that are really important, that differentiate them. And so knowing those things, and those things could be as simple as like, we treat our employees like family. Like that's a differentiator. And having those things in mind before you even start helps drive what you're doing. And if you notice, like we haven't even talked about like getting the job announcement out there or anything, right? So you're starting with understanding what is it that differentiates you and your business. And I should say, by the way, don't hesitate to throw questions in along the way. Or if you want to come off mute and ask questions along the way, that's absolutely fine. Brian, I did see you had a question about needing to sign up. Margaret, can you give her your email, can follow up with the details on that. But don't hesitate with questions along the way. So let's talk a little bit about a job description versus a job announcement. And this is a key piece, right? Remember, I'm saying we're trying to sell it. So what does a job description do? Job description has a very important purpose, and that defines the job and the minimum requirements for a position. It's about clarifying the role, clarifying what you expect. And this is a critical tool for human resources management. And I'm not going to digress because even though I know we have an hour and a half, it's actually a remarkably short amount of time in the scheme of things to talk about this important topic. So, even with all that we're going to talk about with recruitment, it's important to know a job description is an important thing to have. And it's something you want to have. It's essentially your contract with the employee about what their job is. So you want to have a job description, but a job description is meant to be that contract, right? It's not necessarily exciting. It's not necessarily what's going to pull that person into working with you. And that's where the job announcement comes in. And we purposely use different terminology around this because this is about selling the job to applicants. The job announcement is about telling why should they work, telling the prospective employee, why should they work with you, right? Why should they step out into that abyss? Why should they take their chance of working with you? They could be, in a totally another job, another field. Maybe they just graduated, right? And they've got some, different opportunities. Why you? And that's what the announcement is about. It's different than the contract. It's a sales piece. And this is a crucial tool for recruitment. Absolutely crucial because even if somebody is just referred to you, they're going to want to understand what it is that you're trying to hire. And that's also, again, part of the way you sell the job. A effective job announcements, and I should say that, like, let me take a quick digression here. This is a system that we've created, we've used in multiple states with childcare providers. It was originally created in general for small and micro businesses. This was based on over 100 journal articles on good recruitment from across sectors, right? And one of the things that we found right up front is that even though there's a lot of research on what is effective, most organizations don't do it, right? So what they do is they put out that job announcement, right? Or I'm sorry, job description. And we know from research that overwhelms the candidate. They don't necessarily understand what it is that um, that that you want from them, that they should bring to the table that could be exciting. And this is where the job announcement comes in. And what we found is there's three parts to it. It shouldn't be long. In fact, you want it to be relatively short, ideally a page, so that they can read through it, they can get through it. And the first thing is the why. And we're talking about 5 or 6 sentences. And remember the pre-work? This is where your pre-work starts to pay off, right? So you start to talk about how you stand apart as an employer. You have to go back to that value statement and say, what inspires you? What is it that is going to be exciting for them to work for you? And again, it's important to take a step back and think about it from the employee's perspective, right? So it may not be the number one thing on your mind, but what do you think is going to be the number one thing on their mind? And by the way, if you get stuck on this, you have employees you can ask, right? Don't ever hesitate to ask your employees, why did you come to work here? Right? Like, why do you like it here? And I know they may have some reasons why they're not as happy on certain things, but we've also found again and again, employees will tell you the things they like if they're asked. And so, understanding what inspires them, what excites them is what you want to put in this first thing. It's what grabs the attention, just like a sales piece. If you're going to a flyer for your center, by the way, this works too, right? Same concept. What is it that excites a parent about working for you or about engaging you? Same thing with an employee. You start with that first paragraph to draw them in. Part two is the what. And what we say here is, and this is a huge error and I know I did it for years, again, before really understanding the research around recruitment, is sometimes we want to make it the job description. We want to put in everything that they might do, right? Got to do this, you got to do that. I've seen in job descriptions like must have a sense of humor, must be able to do this, could lift 50 pounds, right? All of those things. And those things are important for your job description. Absolutely. But remember, job description is a separate issue. So for this, what we're looking for is what are the 3 to 5 most important things? And the reason why we do that is that one, it helps the candidate better understand what it is you're looking for and if they fit. There was a great research study that's a bit dated now, but it was well done and well regarded, that found the more things that you add, the less likely an applicant is going to apply. And by the way, that was especially true amongst female candidates. Female candidates tend to only apply if they see themselves having 100% of what you're asking for. Male candidates, by the way, will apply with around 60. So that could start a whole discussion around gender, which we're not going to have today. But I think especially in a field where women in the workforce are so crucial, this becomes really, really important, is honing in on what are those 3 to 5 things that are most important to you so you don't discourage anyone from applying. And then the third part of it is the how. It's okay, so how do they apply, right? What do they need to give you? Are there references that you want them to include? Is there any documentation that you want to see? And how they could be submitted. And it seems kind of silly in a way, but sometimes people will forget this. They'll start sharing, again, that job description. And yes, it may have your contact information at the top, but it doesn't invite. It doesn't say to the applicant, this is how you're actually going to apply for this position. So some things to think about if you're stuck, right? Because again, you're hearing how important this is, because even if you get somebody referred to you, this is what you're going to give them. We're going to talk about how this becomes a driver of even how you assess candidates. Need inspiration? Look at other job announcements. Go on Indeed. Indeed's a great resource for this. I don't get any money from them or anything. I just find that they tend to be really good and nationally tend to be really beneficial for childcare providers in terms of finding talent. Look around. Where do you see ones? And again, it doesn't have to just be in your area or in the state of Georgia. This could be nationally. You could just search and say, where are there ones that are exciting to me that I feel reflect what I do? And I'm not saying, and then, plagiarize them. No, but it gives you some inspiration, right? Test your announcement. Ask people you trust, whether it's, maybe you're a director of, um, a network with multiple sites. Ask one of the other directors, what do you think? Maybe you are the sole proprietor and you're it. Ask a friend, ask a colleague, ask your spouse, ask some of the people who work for you, right? Again, coming back to the expertise and say, would this make you even more likely to want to work with us, right? When in doubt, the rule of thumb is be more specific than you think you need to be, right? So, when you talk about things like company culture or something, a lot of people say it's a great place to work. Well, why? Right? So if you have a situation like that, it's better off to be why, to explain that why, than it is to leave it out. So for example, we know a lot of childcare providers value paid time off. So instead of saying like a great place to work, it's a great place to work. And we reflect this by providing every employee with, 2 weeks of paid time off throughout the year. Something like that, that then again draws them in. One of the other things that you are going to want to think about is your minimum qualifications. And I won't go into detail in this, but do think about some of those minimum qualifications that are required. You do want to make sure that those are in there. And, as you do proceed. And again, it's hard because on the one hand, we're saying we don't want this to be a job description where it's going to list out every single thing. But on the other hand, you also want to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. The other thing to think about ahead of time that we often don't is, and I say this particularly because we do see this a lot in childcare, is the employee classification. So one of the things that you will hear in childcare is they are a W-2 employee, and I use that expression for clarity, versus a 1099 employee. A person who is a 1099 employee is actually legally a contractor. Most of the time, what we found, again, working with thousands of providers around the country, is that if you think they're an employee, they're an employee. They're likely, if you think they're a contractor, they're still likely an employee. And what it comes down to is the services they're providing, and the relationship they have, their wages, their financial, and how much direction. So in other words, just in a nutshell, if you're telling them what to do every day, if somebody is telling them what to do every day, if this is the only job that they have in this quote unquote business that they're contracting on, they're an employee. So just one of those things also to set up, because sometimes we will find that childcare providers begin that hiring process and they immediately are doing it under the assumption that that this is something where there's a choice, and there really isn't. So don't hesitate. And by the way, we will share some resources that Decal has that can help you with navigating that. So I don't want to make it sound like just like good luck, right? But those are important things to consider. Another important piece is really understanding the market and the competition. So, as you think about the childhood, workforce, like we've seen a lot of trends, and I know that you've seen them. In general, you always have thin profit margins. And we know that post-pandemic, they've been thinner. And there's been some wonderful relief efforts that have come down from the federal government, from the state of Georgia. But those are limited, right? And so there's always going to be this pressure on your business. And you want to be aware of what the market is and try to get as close as you can to whatever that market rate is for talent. Some of those pressures that we're seeing are labor shortages. So we're seeing a lot more people in COVID, and this trend is continuing, who retired. We're seeing increased inflation, competition for talent as this has happened, um, as well as some shifting demand. And so, in other words, some other businesses growing and wanting that same talent that you do. So, what we're seeing in general in trends, and again, your local area, it's worth, talking to some of the other providers in your area if you can, if you have those relationships, and better understanding what your local area is like. But nationally, and what we find typically in Georgia is that it's a highly competitive environment. You know that. And we also see that this is likely to be a long trend. And so what that means is, there was some hope statistically that as we came out of the pandemic, we'd start to see more people re-entering the workforce. That's not happening. We're actually still seeing people leaving the workforce. So, in other words, when we talk about these workforce trends, these are likely to be going on for some time. And so it's something to be aware of. Um, and that does lead us into probably the trickiest part of the process, which is setting a competitive wage, right? Um, I wish there was a scientific way where I could say, if you do these three things, that's going to give you what the competitive wage should be for your area. What I would suggest is one, keep it as simple as you can in terms of some of the ways you set it. I'll explain what that means in a minute, and focus on local wages. So what we do find in childcare, and again, you've probably experienced this, is that a lot of the wages are really related to what's happening in your area, right? So Marietta is not the same as Atlanta. Um, Even within Atlanta, if you're in Cobb County, is not the same as being downtown in terms of pricing. So the more information that you can get about what's happening directly in your area, the better off you are. So what does that mean? When we say keep it simple, again, look at Indeed, look at other postings that are going up, right? What do they have on them? What are people offering if they're publishing it? Use exit information in interviews from employees you have leaving. It's often hard, right? Because when you lose an employee, you may feel, um, a bit angry, a bit betrayed, whatever, right? Any of those things. But at the end of the day, they can give you some really good information on what the market's like. And that's as simple as asking them, why are you leaving? And look, it doesn't mean that you have to then say, and get into a negotiation with them about, if I go up $2, will you stay? But like asking them, what's the driver, right? Is it that they're leaving because they're getting more money? Is it because of benefits? Is it both, right? And understanding that data can be important. At one point in one of the states we were working in, we would encourage providers to ask that question in their exit interviews, and they were finding there was a sensitivity of a quarter an hour. Seriously. 1/4 an hour difference was what people were leaving for at one point, and this was during the pandemic. But that was really important information because the childcare, the business owner could then say, okay, well, if I go up 50 cents, how much does that mean for my business? And that might get me ahead of it, right? So asking those things. But again, increasingly, what we're finding is it isn't only just money, like, in terms of hourly salary. Consider all their compensation. Is it because they need access to certain benefits? And I would say on the other side of that, don't make assumptions. I had a childcare business owner, a couple, I guess about a year and a half ago, who reached out to me and said, I have such high turnover. I need to immediately start offering XYZ benefits. And they were very expensive. And I said, have you asked your employees, like, are these the reasons why they're leaving? I don't have the time for that. I just need to get the benefits in place. That'll stop it. It's important to ask. Ask your current employees, ask the ones who are leaving. And you'll also gather some of this data as you talk to people, because if they do reject an offer, they're going to say, here's why typically, right? Or you can ask them, right? So think about all of those things around compensation, not just hourly rates, because what may be getting you is that you're not offering PTO or something else that you're not offering. So even if you raise that rate, you're not going to hit it. Again, simple salary benchmarking, it can be done easily, individually. And that's where you do want to start looking at things like Indeed and others, right? But you want to do it in a targeted way. Remember, I said earlier, you want this to be local, you want this to be specific. So, what we recommend with a compensation study, and by the way, this sounds like highfalutin, right? Like, I have to do a compensation study now. I promise you, this is like a couple of hours of work, and it's well worth it because, again, going back to what we said earlier, this competitive labor market is not going away. And I wish I could say otherwise. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news and to say, like, but we don't see an end to it coming. So, do know that, this is an important thing to do. And by the way, do on a regular basis. Like, this may be as often as every 6 months. You want to start by looking at similar businesses and organizations. So some of those may be ones that are competitors, right? Like, you may know that they go to a Happy Bear daycare, right? Like, and that's where you're losing people too. It may just be that you're in a smaller town and there's only 3 providers in the town. Okay, well, let's look at those, right? If there are more than that, right? Again, like, let's say you're in downtown Atlanta, you probably have more than 3 competitors potentially for that labor market. So in those cases, you're going to want to think about size, location, the type of people they're hiring. Again, be specific, right? An assistant director position is going to be very different than a director position in some ways when it comes to this compensation. So the more that you can match the position you're trying to hire, the better. And again, Indeed's a great resource for doing this. You can also talk to people in your network, right? And reach out to some of the people you know. What are they paying, right? Again, do those exit interviews. Find out if you can, if they say they're paying me more, I'm curious, how much more are they paying you, right? And that becomes part of that data. And by the way, you don't need a whole ton of these. You can identify just a handful of these organizations, often like 2, 3, 4, 5 of them will give you a good sense of what the market is. I know it sounds like not that much, even in a place like Atlanta. I promise you, it'll work. And so, but the key is narrowing it down, specifying the type of hire you're trying to do. So again, assistant teacher, different than a lead teacher, right? So if you see things out there, make sure that you're trying to match them to what you do. And again, if you have a Goddard school in town, that may be very different in terms of size, scope, and market than your business. And that's okay, right? But you want to make sure that you're thinking about similar businesses. Step 2, collect that data, right? Look at those job descriptions. Even if they're recently closed, like within the past few months, it still may be helpful to you. Their websites will often have information if you can't find it, like on Indeed, Monster, LinkedIn, Career Builder. You can even Google it sometimes. They'll have it. Glassdoor, depending on the size of the organization, may be helpful to you. But again, very often this will be on their website. You can even call them directly and just ask, I saw you have a position posted. I'm curious, what is the going rate? And you want to review and compare those again against your position and your needs. So be careful about apples and oranges, right? The last step in this compensation study, and again, I promise you this goes faster than it seems, but I want to make sure you have all the details on how you do it. Analyze the information, right? Look at the numbers, remove outliers, right? So if let's say you have 5 or 6 of these, an outlier is one that's particularly low or particularly high. And by the way, again, though this system was developed for micro and small businesses, we found it works extremely well with childcare businesses. And what we typically find is if you have like, 5 or 6, jobs that you've looked at, the top and the bottom will usually get quickly eliminated. Like there's somebody who's usually paying a rate that almost feels out of market. And typically at the bottom, there's somebody who's paying a rate that almost feels out of market, where you say, gosh, that's going to be too low. That doesn't feel right. And then take the remaining numbers and arrange them into high, medium, and low, right? What you want to aim for statistically is the upper 50%. So, in other words, if the average rate for a job is 15 an hour, right? You want to aim for, let's say, the upper range is 15 to $20, right? You want to be in that range, not below it. Ideally, you want to be above the average, right? So that you're getting ahead of the competition. And again, under different circumstances, that would be a different recommendation. But right here, right now, and for the foreseeable future, we're seeing those competitive pressures we talked about be such that if you can get ahead of the pay rate, all the better, right? And of course, just as a reminder, because we do see this from time to time, and I know sometimes it feels like you just want to jump out there and you say, gosh, this is the right person. I've got to pay them this amount. But you still need to consider your finances and budget, right? So check your cash flow forecast. And some of the resources that we're going to talk about later can help you with this, by the way. Some of the work that we're doing with Decal can help you understand, how you manage those finances, but don't ever do it in a vacuum, right? You're better off saying if somebody makes a counteroffer to you and they say, I want 16 an hour instead of 15, you're better off saying, let me get back to you than jumping at it and then later saying, gosh, I really don't have that in my budget to pay, right? Now you have a different problem. So again, consider that budget and cash flow. You do want to have a pay structure, right? So in other words, you do want to also think, about what you're paying other people. There's often a temptation when you bring somebody in, and again, I know I'm harping on pay, but it's just such an important factor in the hiring process right now. In particular, it always is, but particularly right now. So you want to be careful, right? You don't want to bring Janet in at 15 an hour and then Emily's feeling bad because she's been there 10 years and she's still at 13, right? You want to think about those things. How does that interplay with each other? And are you creating a new problem where Emily's going to leave tomorrow when she finds out what Janet makes? And I'm just picking on you guys because you guys are underneath my box on Zoom. So my apologies. Make sure that you listen to your employees, continue to track those competitors. This, unfortunately, this salary studies you're hearing is not like a one-time thing and you're done for the year. Likely, if you're hiring on a regular basis and you have the kind of turnover we see in the industry, likely you're going to want to do this every 6 months. And again, every time you do it, revise your budget, revise your cash flow. You don't want to end up being able to hire somebody now only to have to lay off 2 people in the future, right? Another thing to think about is benefits, and benefits are part of compensation. Think about the big ones that you may be offering. That becomes, again, part of that announcement we've talked about. It also becomes part of the negotiation process. So again, we think about healthcare, we think about retirement, we think about pre-tax deductible accounts. We also think about, as I mentioned earlier, paid time off, which is a critical one, right? And don't think, forget about how you can use some of the funds that are out there for, pay increases, but sometimes those are temporary pay increases. So do think about what happens after that time. So, in terms of offering the right benefits, you want to think about what your employees are valuing, right? And again, this is about talking to them. Think about that case I gave you earlier, right? Where the person just reacted and said, I need, in that case, by the way, he was looking for a healthcare benefit. And I'm all for everyone having healthcare. Like, I don't want to make it sound like, don't ever give people healthcare, it's expensive. But in that case, this person really didn't say, well, what are they going to value? So for example, as I mentioned, PTO is a key benefit. Another one we hear about all the time is retirement, honestly, we hear about it more than healthcare, for better or worse, right? So that is another thing to consider is what are some of the things that you're hearing about benefits, right? And some of the ones that we, hear about, um, are training is a big one, right? Things that PTO, healthcare, yeah, it can be on the list. Retirement's on the list, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a very, very expensive benefit. You want to make sure that it's one that's going to work not only for prospective hires, but also your existing staff. Um, and you want to do this because, again, this does figure into not only the recruitment challenge, but the retention challenge, right? So, how much, are you going to spend on turnover if you have to hire and hire and hire versus how much is it going to cost for a benefit that they may feel is an important one. And again, it's not, you just don't, you're going to hear me say this again and again, don't do this in a vacuum. This is a financial decision as much as it is a retention decision. So understanding what your employees want is important, but also what you can afford is important too. So we've talked a lot about compensation, but it just is so very important to this conversation. So let's talk about getting the word out. There's really two different types of search. And I think sometimes, when we talk to childcare business owners about the search itself, they go and they say, I put it on Indeed. And you know what? That's not necessarily a bad thing. We hear positive things about Indeed in particular. Some of the other job boards also get responses, and there may be local ones. We know people who get positive feedback from their own social media, like posting on their Facebook sites or their Instagram sites or local community pages, right? Like if your town has a page, posting it there, those can all be good things. And that's passive talent search, right? And that means you're getting the word out. And don't get me wrong, like this is part of what I want you to do. So, we're going to talk about active talent search in a minute. This is something you should do because you never know who, as you cast that net out, who you're going to bring in, right? But this could be tricky because it really requires the applicants to find you. So what it means is the applicant has to decide that they're going to be searching for a job today, right? So number one, it means they've got to decide that they're in the market for a new position. They've got to decide to search with the right words that are going to bring up your post. They've got to hope that your post is up high enough that they're going to choose you over other potential posts that come up. And again, that doesn't mean don't do it. But what I'm saying is there's also active talent search, and that you need both of these to really keep up with the market, especially in a competitive market like you have right now. And active talent search means going out and bringing people in, right? So it means, asking Tashita, have you thought about working for us in a way versus hoping that she's going to do a search and decide she wants a new job. This can involve a recruiting firm, right? And I know a lot more childcare providers are turning to recruiting firms. But this can also be through what we call connectors, right? And so what do we mean by that? Whoops, sorry about that. What we mean by a connector is somebody within your network who can connect with the talent you need. There are two connectors I always suggest to childcare providers. And what amazes me is how rarely they're used, right? So I'll share this secret with you, which is not really much of a secret. The parents who use your service and your employees, two biggest connectors. If somebody is there using your service, they have a vested interest in making sure that you have the best talent possible. So getting them engaged, getting them to help you find them is really important. And that could be in the form of giving them an incentive, right? Like saying you get $50 off your monthly fee if you give us a referral on talent and we end up hiring them. It could also be without it. We find parents are willing to network without any incentive. Similar thing with staff, and it can be an incentive with staff, which by the way also becomes a retention thing because now you're engaging the staff in part of the business they're usually not in. They get a kick out of it, right? So using those connectors to reach out and to find the talent where they're talking to a friend who may not have thought about leaving, but now they are. And you see the difference there, right? On one hand, we have the passive search where you're just kind of hoping they're going to find you. And then here you're going out, you're drawing people in. The active talent search tends to be more effective, oddly enough. I'm not saying don't do passive, right? But use both. And again, think about where you can put these things. Are there application portals within your state? Are there local resources, early ed programs that might be in your area, like nonprofits that are, supporting the industry? Are there community colleges in your area? Parent and staff referrals, as we talked about, staff referrals in particular can be a great way to, again, increase retention because you're reminding them of why they like to work there, right? And you're giving them maybe a little bit of cash. Networking with, some of your peer businesses, if you can. I have seen cases where one provider has helped another provider, especially, if we think about the current, um, environment that we're in, we're seeing a lot of directors, a lot of business owners who are graying out of the field, right? Graying out like hair and like my hair, right? So, in other words, they're retiring. And very often they want the best for their staff, especially staff who's been there. So if you hear about somebody, who's leaving, right? I'm not trying to, start any rumors, but just like pulling one name off the board. Like if Martha, is going to be retiring in a few months, and you're going to need staff, maybe a nice conversation to say, Martha, like, who do you really like? Would you want to leave knowing that they have a job? That can be a great way to do it. So it doesn't have to be a competitive situation. It can actually be a situation where everyone feels like they're winning. Teachers associations can be helpful. Homeschool programs can be another one. Facebook groups, care.com, Indeed. These are ones, again, where we see a lot of candidates coming in. Again, as you think about these candidates and connectors, right? You want to make sure that you are, if you can, reaching out to candidates directly. So those are people who are going to go for the job or are going to apply for the job. You may know people in your network who to ask, right? Again, this goes to the sales approach. It may be a little uncomfortable. You may not want to hear no from a friend of a friend or something who's in your network, but it's a competitive environment. It's worth the investment. And so you want to think about them. You also want to think about these connectors because they amplify your reach. They're going to help you reach beyond the people who you know. And again, friends, family, the families you serve, current employees, all really good places to go, right? And be specific about it. I think sometimes there's a temptation to just, maybe you do a monthly newsletter and you say, yeah, we're hiring. Passive, right? That's okay. I'm not saying don't do it, but you want to also think about the active. You want to think about how do we draw that person in? How do we get somebody to come in and be able to say, hey, instead of just posting it in the parent newsletter, maybe there's two or three parents who just seem to be those social people, right? Like them, right? The people who seem to know everybody. And going and specifically saying to them, I'd love to have your help. If you know of any friends, people in your network, family members who would be interested in working here, we'd love to hear from them. Here's our job announcement. You can share it with them. I'm giving you a few copies. I'd love if you handed it out to some people. So you can see I'm being very specific as I'm talking about with that person what they can do. The more specific you are, the more likely they are to take action. If your action is, we have a job open, they've done the action. Yes, I acknowledge you have a job open. It's different if you say, here's the position description, go out there, could you please hand it to some people right? And again, think about offering an incentive if you hire, right? So it isn't just if they show up, but if you hire, do they get an incentive from, as a parent, as an employee, maybe even as a friend, right? Like, maybe you'll say, look, if you can help me out, I'd love it. Buy you lunch, I'll get you coffee, right? But those incentives definitely help, right?
Very sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, sorry. I'm just making sure the interpretation was working now. You can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. And thanks for jumping on, Carlos. And I should have said that. I didn't want to, interrupt anything. I did see Carlos had gotten on, and so we do have Spanish interpretation. I have had it for a while, so my apologies. Carlos is on our team. Um, and so, some things to consider other professionals in the childcare field as connectors. And again, that could be, a friend of yours who's a director of another center. I was actually talking with a center director in Georgia just Monday, and she is part of a multi-center network. And what was fascinating was she said, in the past, we acted like little islands. So if I had somebody who came in for a job and I was full, I didn't tell anyone. I just said, "Oh yeah, sorry, we don't have anyone, Jessica. We're full." And what they started doing, which really helped them around talent, was started to say, "Oh, Jessica, I'm full, but you know what? If you're willing to go 5 more minutes down the road, we have another facility that just as nice as this one that does have a position open. Let me help you get there." Right. So if you notice, again, I'm not saying like, Jessica, good luck, go down the street and figure it out. Instead, what I'm saying is, let me actively draw you in on behalf of one of my other directors, right? So think about those things. Like, are there other professionals in the area that you can do, right? And think about who you could be reaching out for in terms of professionals, you know. And again, I'm not trying to say everyone should poach from everyone else. I know that could be a problem, but at the same time, what it could be is it could be as simple as, Chantel, you used to work for me. I know you went someplace else, you went to the school district or whatever. Um, I'm curious if you know anyone who may be interested in working here, right? And reaching out to her. Social media, again, great way to do it. Locals parents group can be another one. I think sometimes we think about social media, and we should think about your social media. And as I mentioned earlier, community groups, but also think about parent groups. We find increasingly that parents, and again, and I should have mentioned this earlier, when you talk about networking with your parents, we're finding increasingly that parents not only can be good advocates and recruiters for you, for other people, but they themselves may be the talent. So, in other words, it is not unusual for us to have somebody reach out to a parent and say, we have a job opening, and the parents say, actually, I'm interested in that job. My little ones are getting older. I've always loved being here at your center. I'd love to keep, to be involved in some way. Or, maybe I'd love to be in the same building that my child is in, you know? So think about, parents and parent groups as, again, a fertile ground. Is that even though they're also potentially a customer, they also may be a place for talent, right? And again, think about some of those incentives that you may offer. And I should say, as I've mentioned, not only to people who refer to you, but you also maybe think about new hires and incentives there as well. And retention incentives. And we'll talk more about retention in a few minutes. But unfortunately, and I wish I could say it was a simple linear situation where I would just say, go from point A to point B and you'll be fine and hired. Unfortunately, it's like playing a multi-level game. You have to think about how you draw the talent in, how you get the talent, but then also how you keep the talent so that you're not constantly having to go back and recruit. So unfortunately, you need to think about those things at once. And we think about incentives, that could be a much better way than a rate increase in some ways. Because remember, you can structure it in some really interesting ways, right? If you increase, let's say we give Crystal an extra dollar an hour, well, typically that's forever. Now, yes, we can whole different discussion if we could talk about demotions and reducing wages. You can do it. It's tricky. It's not easy. It's not fun. And by the way, that's a good way to get turnover, right? Is when you start demoting people. Um, But an incentive could be a way to do it temporarily. So instead, we could say to Crystal, I'm going to give you $500 after 6 months that you've been here, right? So it encourages her to stay, it encourages her to take the job, but you're not making a permanent commitment. So something to think about. Let's talk about reviewing applications. And, I know it may seem like it's a little bit burdensome, like one more thing to worry about. But you say like, a scorecard, why do I need it? Right? Scorecards are really important. Again, if I go back to that research that we did years ago about um, the research that's been done, and again, I'm not saying like scientific research is everything, right? But in this case, what fascinated me about it was how little we actually do. Scorecards are critical. And honestly, after we did this research, I actually called up a protege of mine from years before and I apologized to her. And I said, Mary, everything I taught you about good recruitment was wrong. And I said, everything I said, ignore it. And I'm going to tell you what you should be doing. And part of that is having a scorecard. I think sometimes we feel like I could look at a resume or I could meet somebody and I instantly know if they're a fit or not. In reality, your brain is complex, but also in some ways more simplistic. I know I'm getting into like neuroscience, but I swear this is relevant. Um, but it's sometimes it goes for simplistic things so it can better understand a complex world. And so sometimes when we look at a resume or we look at an individual, we boil it down to the things that may or may not be important to us in the long run. A scorecard helps us to really think about what's important to us, right? Before we met the person and we were drunk on this wonderful conversation we're having with them, right? Like when we were sober before that, what did we really want? What did we need? And so the scorecard becomes tied to that announcement. Remember, I said we are going to keep just a handful of things in that announcement that are most important? This is what it's setting you up for, too, is to make it easier to make your decisions. And it's super easy to do this. Basically, with a scorecard, what you're going to do is you're going to take those 3 to 5 things that are most important to you, and you're going to say, what are the most important things within those important things, right? And what's going to happen with this is this reduces bias. And by bias, I don't just mean racial cultural bias. What I also mean is what they call cognitive bias. Again, that bias of I flip through, that's how I used to do it. Right? I used to be very proud of myself. I would teach people, I'd be like, I could flip through a resume and I could almost smell the right person. Awful way to do it. And when I started doing scorecards, I realized how bad I was doing recruitment, right? Because we have blind spots. We have things that unconsciously grab our attention that aren't necessarily the things we want. So, very simple way to make a scorecard. Use Excel, use Google Sheets. You could use Apple Numbers spreadsheet program. You can also just do pen and paper. Like that's fine too, right? Super simple. First column, you put the employee's name, as you meet with them or as you review their resumes rather, right? Um, and then what you do is in each column, have those 3 to 5 things that are most important. You want to assign a weight to it so that everything adds to 100. 100 isn't magical. It's just most of us are used to like 100 points on a test and stuff. So it seems to be simpler. So what do I mean by that is you may say, we need X and we need Y. X is more important than Y. So I'm going to give up to 40 points for X and only up to 20 points for Y. So you see how we took those priorities you put in your announcement, and now we're making it even more clear. And again, you're doing this before you rate them. So the idea is that you then start to know what your scorecard is, right? How you're going to score each person that comes in. Whoops, sorry about that. And again, this becomes a critical way for you to then know who rises to the top, right? Who's going to be the person that you want to spend your time with recruiting and working with and trying to draw in to your organization. Retention. Another part of this, as I've said, like when we think about recruitment, we can't think about it without retention, right? And so as we think about this, we've talked a lot about how do we draw the person in? How do we find the right person? How do we do that scorecard so we know this is the likely candidate? And by the way, one thing real quick before we leave scorecards is do keep in mind the scorecard is a guide. It's a way to guide your decisions. It's not a computer that's deciding for you. So, sometimes you'll find people rate highly on a scorecard, but then when you interview them, when you start to meet with them, when you call their references, it's somebody else who's really better. So again, as you think about recruitment, you can't do it without retention, right? Because you can't put all your time here recruiting and none of it here retaining, or you're going to have to do more and more of this to a point where it's going to get even worse, right? Even more difficult. So remember to recognize, some of the things you want to look at is looking for employee stress, looking for workplace stress, and thinking about how you can increase satisfaction, right? What does stress look like? In terms of the individual, irritation, anger, denial. I'm fine. And they're not fine, right? Uncertainty, anxiety, nervousness, tiredness, being overwhelmed, having a lack of motivation, burnout, right? Are they coming in every day and they just don't look like they want to be here? Do they report having trouble sleeping or focusing on what they're doing? Do they seem sad, depressed, right? Having difficulty concentrating, changes in appetite, energy, interest. Those are all signs to you that you may have an individual problem, right? So, what do you do about it? And by the way, as we talk about some of these things, we're trying to emphasize things that we know you can do right now. We know that you're resource constrained. So, right, like, so you may say, well, we could offset work stress by having an on-site masseuse every week, right? And that would be great, but we know that you don't necessarily have that in your budget, right? So what can you do? Encouraging some disconnection, right? We had one provider in Texas who had a significant difference in stress reduction and intern retention just because of disconnection. What she did was she said, when you take a break, leave the building. Yeah, it wasn't like mean. Like, I don't want to make it sound like it's like, you know, you are prohibited, Martha, from being in the building or something along those lines. But what they did was they created an environment that created the ability for people to leave the building and not worry. That helped a great deal. Small breaks throughout the day. Yes, you want to give people like a meal break, you want to conform to laws, but even just a 15-minute break here and there can help. And again, that could be scheduled, but that can also be just, hey, I know people are having a tough time in the infant room today. Those kids are like crazy today. Okay, let's give them a little bit of a break, right? Let's see if we shift this person from this room here. Could we give a little bit of relief, maybe every 15 minutes, just trade people out, for a little bit? So they just have a minute to take a deep breath and return to it. Being consistent. And this is fascinating because this comes from work that we've done with childcare employees. And what we found was one of the greatest points of stress for them is not knowing what room they're going to be in, not knowing what their hours are going to be, not knowing how their day is going to look. And I know, for those of you who are directors, I understand why that happens. I'm not trying to be a jerk about it and say, why would you make it inconsistent? Sometimes you don't know what's going to happen, right? Somebody calls in sick and you don't know that that's going to happen ahead of time. So you say, gosh, I didn't know that was going to happen. We're going to have to roll with the punches. But the more you can make it consistent, the better. The more that there can be understanding of what's happening and why, the better. Last one, time off. And again, I don't take that lightly. I know I'm an employer too, right? So I know that time off is a cost, right? And of course, considering there's a couple of my employees on this call, I should make it sound like, their money sucks, right? That's not the point. The point is that it's a cost, right? Because if you're going to have people have time off, then you have to get a substitute. or you have to figure out again, which may cause inconsistency, how you rearrange some of your rooms and your staffing to get it done, all of those things. So, but we also know that when we hear about benefits, it comes up again and again as a critical benefit for staff, as a way for them to recharge and to stay there. So even though there's a cost, you then want to say, what's the long-term cost of turnover? So what are some other ways that you could be helping to manage this stress? Check in, ask your employees. And I know that's sometimes hard because sometimes you don't want to hear the answer because you know they're stressed out. Um, but even just asking, and again, this is something we've heard again and again from employees, is they'll say, look, I know Jessica can't do anything about the workload this week because people are out sick, but just that she asked me how I was doing made a difference. It made me feel better. It made me feel like I was important, right? Make changes to the workday. Think about, excuse me, think about, can you slip in a couple of little extra breaks? And again, we're not trying to make it inconsistent and chaotic, right? We already talked about how that could be a problem. But are there ways to make it more regular? And that could be as simple as, I was talking with one childcare business owner the other day who was talking about how she had a decrease in turnover by just having definite times when people leave. And it cost her more because she had to get somebody who could cover part-time some of the rooms. Um, and I won't go into all the details of how she did it. It was kind of interesting. But the point is that just having that set workday end, right? Like, so Angie knows, like, when I hit 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, I go home, made a big difference versus Angie sitting there saying, is it going to be 5 o'clock? Is it going to be 6 o'clock? Is it going to be 7? What's it going to be today? That uncertainty wears down and makes it more stressful and then leads to more turnover because Angie hears, oh, well, I could work for this other childcare provider and they have set hours. Again, incentives and rewards. And think about things that are, um, these could be things that are very simple. I hear all the time from childcare businesses, and I'm not talking about like the Goddard schools and the kinder cares. I'm talking about bread and butter small childcare businesses, family childcare providers who have employees, right, who don't have a whole lot of money for incentives. I'm not talking about give them, a $10,000 bonus every month. What I'm talking about is, one provider who I was talking to recently said, I have an employee of the month. I give them a $25 gift card. And she said, like, we're always able to kind of figure that out. I could figure out where I could find $25 in the budget, and people love it. It could be, and this is another one. Again, I wish I was like, I'm pulling these all like ones I'm making up. These are ones I'm pulling from actual centers we've seen be effective. It could be a pizza Friday, right? Or getting lunch once a month. It doesn't have to be a constant sink of money, but having little incentives, having little rewards, just is a regular reminder that to employees that they're valued, and that brings down their stress, right? So that inner dialogue isn't happening of not only do I have to work so much, but they don't really even appreciate me. You're starting to silence that. And again, if you hear what I'm saying, I'm definitely not saying, if you had $1,000 for incentives and rewards, I would suggest to you, based on what I've seen again and again in the field, is like I would say, Tanya, don't give one person $1,000. Instead, maybe, commit $75 a month to some incentive. That's going to get you more. Because in the end, more people are going to feel it because it doesn't have to be a high ticket number. It just has to be something that reminds them that they're valued, that they're loved, that you want them to be there. Encourage staff to enjoy time outside of work. I mean, again, I know it seems simple, and that comes in two forms that we've seen that are really effective. Part of it is that if you can do paid time off, even if you can't, not constantly having them worried about being pulled in, right? And being like, well, we had somebody sick. We always call so and so. Let's just get her to come in. She'll come in. Now, maybe something where you have somebody who likes to hustle, right? And that's different, right? If you have a employee who says, gosh, I'm saving for a house. Anytime you can bring me in, please do. That's different. But Sometimes we go to the same people again and again, and those are the people who say yes, but in their heads, they're saying, gosh, I wish sometimes I could just have a day off, right? So encourage them to have that time. And by the way, part of that, what we've seen work is not only encouraging them to take that time, but even just saying it. Like, I hope you have a great weekend. I know it seems simple, but these things we find add up again and again. If somebody is struggling and it becomes, something where you say, this is, seems like it's on a regular basis, again, reach out to them, talk to them, encourage them that you understand, even if you can't do anything. And I'm not trying to say like smoke them, right? Like make them think that you think you care and you don't. Just being able to say you understand, right? If I say to Susan, Susan, I understand what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to do what I can. Now, unfortunately, I can't give you a big raise. I can do this for you, right? Or maybe you can't do anything, but even just saying, I acknowledge it. You're having a rough time versus what we often do, which is we say, oh, gosh, I don't know if I can do anything for Susan. I'm just going to ignore her and pretend that she's not really upset. And, and I should say, by the way, before we go into that, the other part of this is what I have found is that when you start getting to really the struggling staff member, the staff member who's having constant issues, it's not only a turnover problem with that individual, it often becomes something that radiates out, right? And I'm picking on Susan, I'm picking on you just because you're, near me on the board, right? But Susan's struggling, so now we might lose Susan, but Susan's demeanor, Susan's stress radiates out. Now Martha's upset, Chantel's upset, and now you have three people who might leave. And again, you can't necessarily solve every problem, but hearing that you're listening, hearing that you care is really important because it acknowledges that they're there, that their feelings are real. And so even if you cannot do anything, that becomes helpful. One thing that we do, if you do have, funds, and I don't say it lightly, to spend, right, is yes, of course, we've talked about, and that increasing rates can help, but also benefits can help too. And those can be things that increase retention, but we're also finding as we go back to that salary survey, remember how I said, look at all the compensation, not just the money they're getting paid per hour, but what are the other benefits that they're getting in the broader picture? We're seeing increasingly benefits coming into play as being part of the compensation and people leaving because they may say, oh, yeah, you pay the same as they do, but they're willing to give me this, right? And it's important because not only does it keep you competitive, but it also reminds the staff that they're valued, that they're human beings, right? You're saying to them, I was talking to I keep saying this the other day, I talked to a lot of providers. It's a childcare business owner the other day who was saying to me, she started offering a very, very small retirement benefit. She was able to carve out the money for it. We're not talking about thousands of dollars, we're talking about like a couple $100s. But she said the impact on retention was huge because it showed the staff that they were valued. It made them feel like they were full human beings, right? That it isn't just Angie, show up for work, do your thing, go home, but like, Angie, I'm thinking about your future. We're going to start putting a couple $100s in a retirement account for you. And again, reminds Angie that we're concerned about keeping you here. You're important. As we think about some of those common benefits, again, I can't say it enough. Paid time off is a big one, and I know it's not cheap. I know it, but we are seeing increasingly this is a big deal, and that could be holidays, vacation days, sick days, some of those even, right? Because we do know some providers, will offer as little as possible because of the cost constraints. And if you can make it work, this can make a difference even when you can't pay top wages. And so not only, by the way, does that make you more competitive, but going back to what we were saying about stress, having that time away helps them recharge, helps them be better, helps them reduce their stress. So there's a double bottom line there for you. There's we're competitive, we're offering these benefits, but then there's also we're reducing your stress. You're less likely to say, Tanya's not going to say, I'm done. I'm leaving today, right? She's more likely to say, gosh, I had a 3-day weekend that really helped. I'm back at it. Another one we do see increasingly, but not as much as PTO, is some sort of health insurance. And, to be clear, this could be medical, but it could also be dental, it could be vision, it could be a prescription coverage program. Like it doesn't have to be a gold-plated healthcare program. And that could be full insurance, it could be telehealth, it could be discount programs. Like we've seen providers who have signed up for some of the prescription discount programs. Little or no cost to the business owner, big impact for the employees. Again, why? Saves them a little bit of money, but it also makes them feel valued. You're thinking about them and how their life is and the stress they have out of work. Another one, and we'll talk more about how we can engage in coaching and other things and some of the resources that are out there. But another one that we often talk about is health reimbursement arrangement, which is a way that you could take the healthcare costs and make them, reimbursements, make them part of your business. So they become deductible to you as the business owner, and it helps the individual save some money. And it's deductible to them too, tax deductible, excuse me. And again, it could be that the employer covers part of it, nobody, for better or worse, and we could talk about that separately, but it's very, very rare that the employee pays nothing. And sometimes, again, as I mentioned, it might not be that the employee or the employer pays anything, but even having the access to the benefit, having access to a dental program, even if the employee is paying all of it, has value because they may not be able to get access otherwise. Retirement is another big one. And this helps them think about the long term. And again, this can come with an individual tax benefit as well. You can do it, and we have a whole webinar on retirement. So that's a whole detailed one, right? But do know at the highest level, this could be a set amount, right? You can match their contribution. It could be a one-time thing. There are different retirement plans where you could say, gosh, this year we've gotten a bunch of state grants, life is going good. We are willing to, open up a retirement account for you and put $1,000 in for every employee or something. There are ones you can set up where next year you don't have to do a gift to it, or I'm sorry, a contribution to it. That's okay. It could be in cases, and in fact, again, say it again, talking to a provider just the other day about benefits who is doing this, where she isn't even contributing to retirement, but she created a plan so the individual can. And that alone, so that if you think about it from your employee's perspective, like Brian isn't sitting there saying, how do I navigate the system and figure out, who I should go to get a retirement plan. Instead, I could just check this box and now I'm doing my contributions out of my paycheck. Wow, that was nice of the employer to make it easier for me. Supplemental insurance, such as, any sort of unexpected event, short and long-term disability, accidental insurance. Those can be things that can be helpful. And again, lower cost than doing, for example, ongoing health insurance. Employee assistance programs, of all different kinds where they can call somebody and get help. More cost effective, right, than typical health insurance. Doesn't replace it, right? They still need health insurance. But these things begin to, again, make them feel loved, regarded. They do help them in certain circumstances in their life. Another one, and again, this is like one that amazes me that we're seeing more, but it's kind of surprising that it isn't coming up more and more than it does. Discounted childcare for the employees' dependent children. Big, big benefit. We all know and hear all the time about the cost of childcare. It is high. And there's a lot of good reasons. I'm not trying to pound you and say, why are the prices so high? Trust me, I understand them as well as you do, why the prices are up there. And that in reality, they're really not so high when you consider all of the costs that go into childcare. But for the individual, there's that perception. And so even discounted childcare can be a big deal not only because of the affordability of it, but also peace of mind for the employee. A lot of employees do think it's really critical for them to be near their child, have that opportunity if they're on a break to check in on their kid. I mean, I remember years ago doing some focus groups with parents. This was in Pennsylvania. And one of the parents said, the hardest part about childcare is you never stop worrying. Like and she loved her provider. She was in a quality rated um, center, but she said, but you always worry. And that was before I had kids, and now I totally understand it. At the time, I didn't fully get it. I was like, what do you mean? Um, and this is true of your employees as well. Sometimes just being able to check on their kid becomes a value where they may say, yeah, I'm not making as much money, but I'm able to drop in on my child once a day when I'm on break, or I'm able to know they're okay. Or if they have a problem, there's instant access to them. I don't have to like get in the car and drive across town. So that's a big one. Bonuses, as I mentioned, um, bonuses can be helpful because they're not committing you permanently. And I hate to say it that way, but it becomes an incentive. Temporary pay increases can be the same thing, where if you do, let's say, get a grant, that allows you to increase rates. One of the things I always suggest is do put in writing that it's temporary, because when it ends, unless you know how you're going to sustain it, you want to have that in writing for legal purposes that say it's temporary. But those and bonuses can be very helpful and very powerful, especially when it's tied to some sort of activity. Like, we're going to give you a bonus for every quarter this year. So every 3 months, we're going to give you a little bit more, but that gets them to stay, right? Or you're a new hire for 6 months, you get a bonus. So some thoughts on what you can be doing. Think about writing and utilizing an effective 3-part job announcement. And we'll talk about some resources that can help you with this. Think about how you're reviewing your applicants. Are you using a scorecard? Even if you're midway through the process, is there a way you can adapt a scorecard, right? How can you use benefits and other incentives to attract and retain the talent you want? And then how can you be more supportive of your employees? And again, as we've talked about throughout, these are not heavy duty, high expenses that we're talking about. But what's the one thing? Challenge yourself to say, what's the one thing I can do next week that would be valued by my employees and may cost me next to nothing? And again, that might just be making sure I'm going to ask each one of them, how are you doing? Right? Are you doing okay? How's your family? Even something as simple like that can be helpful. I promised you some support, right? There's a number of different things that are offered through Decal, right? There's the opportunity for one-on-one business coaching. We also have the ability to go through tracks, small group tracks where you can study some of these topics, including recruitment, and have some homework assignments, interact with a coach on them. There's also, if we could, and we'll get the website up, but there's also the opportunity to have some, there's also tax education is another one. But we also have the opportunity for you to get resources 24/7 that you can access anytime. That can also help you with being able to do some of these things and navigate some of these things yourself. And Margaret, if you have a chance, if you could put that, thanks, you're already on it. Okay. Um, and so you can see there's Margaret's putting in some of those things for you. I know we have a small amount of time that's left. There's been a few questions along the way. Are there other questions that people may have? I know I threw a lot at you. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, and Margaret beat me to it. There is that full library of resources. The Thriving Business Academy is an incredible resource that Decal has started that includes, other partners, not just us, but the National Center on Early Childhood Quality Assurance, the Small Business Development Center at the University of Georgia is a part of this. You'll see those in the links that Margaret has shared. Even if you feel like, gosh, I got all of this, I feel good, you helped, there's resources up there. All of these resources are free of charge. I strongly suggest take advantage of them. Not every state has this. In fact, very few states have this for childcare providers. Decal recognizes the challenges that you're facing and how challenging and how difficult it can be in the current environment. There's help here. And again, you can go deeper into some of these topics. There's the opportunity for one-on-one help, not only with some of the topics we've talked about today, like recruitment and retention and benefits, but also tax educations. We can review some of your taxes, see if there's opportunities for you to save money. There's a whole slew of opportunities there for you to grow your business. So with that, I appreciate your time today. Again, my apologies for some of the roughness at the beginning with translation. Thank you, Carlos, for jumping on in a pinch and being able to offer those services. And Margaret, also thank you throughout for supporting this. And again, if there's other questions you have along the way, interact with the resources that you have at the Thriving Business Academy, and we'd be happy to help.
Gary, I did end up with one question in the chat, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, please.
Brian was asking if in a job announcement, if you recommend disclosing the salary or hourly rate in your job announcement.
That's a great question, Brian. And I'm glad you're still here. And thank you, Margaret, for being that. I missed it. I skimmed through them and I must have missed it. I do. And I'll tell you why. The definition of pay can be very different for different people. As we talked about, even in a given market, even if you just look locally, you're probably going to end up with a couple of outliers, right? Remember what I said, you're going to end up with some that are high, some that are low. It's not going to help you. It's not going to help the applicant if they apply for a job, you love them, they love you, and then you find out there's no way you can meet their salary requirements. Conversely, you may end up with somebody who says, gosh, I don't think they could ever pay me what I want. And then they see the number and they go, gosh, I'm going to apply. They can't. So I always feel like it's going to save you time in the long run. And it also, I feel, and this is more anecdotal, signals an openness to the employee and says, we're happy to share what we know and what we have. So just, again, is there a hard and fast rule where I'd say scientifically, always show it? There isn't, not with some of the other things I've talked about, like where we know the more things you throw in that job announcement, the less likely people are to apply. That's scientific. The putting the money in isn't. Anecdotally, what I've found with our work with childcare providers is if you feel comfortable, if you can do it, put it in there. Margaret, did I miss others? And hopefully, Brian, if that was helpful, great. If there's other other questions anyone has, you can jump off of mute even. Okay. All right. Well, we're at time. Thank you all. Sonia, thank you for being here as well on behalf of Decal. We hope this was helpful to you. We also hope you avail yourselves of those other resources. Margaret put yet another one in on tax education training session that's coming up. There's stuff popping up all the time to help you save money and make money for your childcare business. So please do avail yourselves of them. And hopefully we'll be able to speak again and help with your business in the future.